Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest today is Nancy Leong, Professor of Law at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. We will discuss co-authoring articles with students, focusing on her articles, Consent Forms and Consent Formalism, which she co-authored with Kira Sueshi, and Communication in Cyberspace, which she co-authored with Joanne Miranda. So welcome to the podcast, Nancy.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. I'm really looking forward to this because, as you know, co-authoring with students is a subject that I'm really interested in as well and have done a couple times. And I'm really interested to hear about your experiences and to get your recommendations as well because you've had so much experience with it.
Well, it's something I really enjoy, and I'm excited to have a chance to talk about it. So, this should be great.
Okay, well, I was thinking maybe we could start by talking about each one of the two papers that we decided to focus on for the episode, just so that listeners kind of have a sense of what the papers were about so that they'll better understand what the collaboration process was like. So maybe we could start with the one that you did with Kira Sueshi. What kind of consent forms was that paper about, and sort of why were they important in that context?
Yeah, so consent forms are a really interesting issue in the law enforcement context. And a lot of my scholarship has dealt with Fourth Amendment law. And the way that consent forms come up in the Fourth Amendment context is that when a police officer wants to do a search, but doesn't have probable cause to do that search, or, doesn't have one of the exceptions to probable cause to do the search, he can ask for consent, right? And consent, if it's given in a manner consistent with the Constitution, obviates the need for either probable cause or a warrant or really anything else. The consent of the person whose property is being searched is enough. And so the way that consent forms come up is they have become increasingly used in police departments as a way of putting into writing the fact that consent was given. And so Kira is one of our 2013 graduates here at the University of Denver. We're interested in looking at how frequently consent forms were used and what happened to the people in whose cases consent forms were used compared to people who gave consent but didn't do so in writing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what were your findings?
So the findings were really interesting. I think probably the most interesting. So we looked at a set of cases that were decided between 2005 and 2009. And this is a large set of cases. I won't, for purposes of a podcast, drill down into all of the data, but it was a large set of cases, some involving consent given with a consent form and some involving consent obtained, but without a consent form, memorializing that consent. And what we found was that when there was a written consent form, courts were very likely to treat that as outcome determinative, meaning that if the defendant consented to a particular search in writing, he or she was treated by the court as though he or she had almost certainly waived the Fourth Amendment right. When, like defendants who hadn't signed a consent form, they also almost always lost, but it wasn't as automatic. There's actually an analysis of whether they had, given consent voluntarily. And so we thought that this is really interesting, this idea, based on kind of this base level empirical finding that, like when there is something in writing, it basically means that the court will rely on that rather than looking at the surrounding circumstances.
Yeah, that seems like they're giving a bit too much weight to the fact that it just happens to be signed as opposed to not.
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And in particular, the idea that, if you can coerce somebody into giving consent to search, then surely you can also coerce them into signing a form, right? And saying, oh, like this is just a little bit of paperwork. And, so our conclusion is not that consent forms are bad, but just that courts need to examine them as closely as they would a situation in which there was no consent form, and not treat it as sort of, both the beginning and the end of the inquiry.
Yeah. Yeah. So how did this collaboration come about? Was Kara one of your students? Was she a research assistant for you before you started working on it together?
So both, actually. So she was a student in one of my classes, a seminar that I teach on Section 1983 litigation. For non-lawyers, that's the statute under which constitutional claims get into federal court in the first place. So she was my student, and I thought she was fantastic. So I asked her to be my research assistant. This was literally my very first year at the University of Denver.
Wow.
And
Cool.
yeah, and she did such good work as a research assistant that then over the summer, right? So this is the summer after my first year at the University of Denver. For her, it was the summer after her second year and before her third year. I asked her if she would be interested in writing something with me. And at this point, this was only the second time that I'd thought about collaborating with a student, but she was just so wonderful that, like she had already helped me with the research. I thought that she might, benefit from and both benefit from and contribute a lot to the actual writing of the article. So it was a really kind of natural progression from getting to know this really fantastic student in the classroom to working with her in a researching context to realizing that we could expand the collaboration further.
Cool. So to clarify, this is a project where she was your research assistant on the project and then later became your co-author on the same project. So sort of a development of the same relationship.
Yeah, I think that's an accurate way to describe it. Although I will say that the project that she began researching originally was not a very well-developed idea at that point in time. It was basically me wanting to know more about consent forms and, asking her, can you find me all the cases where a court decided an issue relating to consent forms during this period of time? And, me not really knowing at all what she was going to find or what that was going to look like. So there was definitely some evolution in, I think, everybody's thinking about both what the project was going to be and then the scope of our collaboration as things went around, or as things went along. It happened really organically.
Right. What was the writing process like? How did you sort of break that up or manage that with her?
That's a really good question. And, I would actually love to hear how you manage this as well, because it's something that I really end up taking a different approach with every time, depending on the student and the project and, like a host of other factors. In this particular situation, once I saw what the data I've described to you, once I saw what the data were looking like, I had a pretty clear idea of what I thought the paper should look like in my mind. And so before coming on the podcast, it was actually kind of fun to look back, and I pulled up the memo that I wrote her, back in I guess it would have been 2013, about what I tentatively thought the project would look like and who I thought should write each section. And so I sent her this, it was a 2-page memo basically saying, I think the introduction should say these things. Section 1, we should describe the doctrine. Section 2, we should describe our methodology and what we found when we looked at the cases. And, like I suggested, a person to write each of those sections. So I was a little bit top down in terms of the high level organization of the project. But in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, like the arguments that we made within each section, and even more so, the reforms that we ended up recommending, Kira really brought a lot to that. And like in terms of the prescriptions, one of the things we talk about is increased use of video cameras, like during the interaction where an officer is asking somebody to sign a form. We think that actually could be very helpful. So, I mean, I think I would say that I dictated the structure of the project. I did quite
Mm-hmm.
a bit of dictating the structure at the beginning, but then in terms of the ideas and the substance, like that was an equal partnership. It wasn't like I
Right.
was the boss and she was a sort of a like an employee or something like that. I would call that like a true collaboration.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it comes as no great surprise that you're considerably more organized than I am. But one thing I would be interested to know about the collaboration aspect as well is sort of how you went about doing it. I mean, did you mostly kind of exchange ideas like in person during like office hours or meetings, or telephone, email, sort of in document collaboration? What did you find most effective?
We, I think, did literally all the things you described at some point. Um, but the original memo that I mentioned, I wrote after about a 2 hour conversation. I think maybe we were in my office at school. A 2 hour conversation about what she had found and what it meant. And I think I was writing on my whiteboard, so we had a long conversation. And from that, I drew the structure. But then after that, I opened a Dropbox folder. I'm a fan of Dropbox. So I opened up a Dropbox folder and,
Mm,
we had a draft that we went back and forth on. We also had a lot of other documents. So whenever I do a collaboration with a student or anybody, I have a blank Word document that's just called thoughts. And anything we don't have time to deal with in the moment can go there, right? Like a link the other person should look at because it's interesting, or a case that like we
mm,
hadn't found before, or something like that. um, and so Dropbox became sort of the medium that we communicated to each other
mm.
through a lot. We also early on drew up a calendar on Google Calendars. Like I literally had a calendar that was called Kira. And we set some tentative deadlines about, okay, well, like Nancy will send this section to Kira by this date, or, the other way around.
Mm.
Um, so, I mean, it was a very, it wasn't sort of like, okay, you write your sections and I'll write mine and then I'll see you in 3 months. There's a lot of interaction.
Yeah, yeah, it's amazing how that works. I mean, I use Google Drive in much the same way it sounds like you use Dropbox. So they're sort of more or less the same thing, I think.
I thought of using. I think Google Drive has gotten a
Yeah.
lot a lot better in the like in the years since I first started collaborating with students. Like a lot better as a tool, and like I've wondered whether um, that would be a useful thing to do down the road.
Yeah, give it a try. I found it really useful, especially when you want to write with someone at the same
Yeah,
time. Um,
yeah.
which
That's the thing about Dropbox. There are definitely a lot of emails back and forth. Like, are you in the document? No. Are you in the document?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, I've actually done collaborations with people where we were both working on the same document at the same time. And it's actually like weird, but kind of can be like ultra productive
Yeah,
as well.
yeah,
I don't know. Maybe give it a try sometime.
yeah. No, I'd love to
So
check
maybe
it out.
Yeah, maybe we can switch to the other paper and kind of compare the collaboration experience.
Sure. Yeah.
So the one with you wrote with Joanne Mirando, communication in cyberspace. What was that paper about, and how did that collaboration take place?
Yeah. So Joanne was also originally my student in a criminal procedure class. And her goal was to be a prosecutor. And she is today a prosecutor, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Again, like she really knocked it out of the park in my class. She was fantastic. And by that point in time, I was having students do a memo assignment as a kind of a non-traditional midterm. And so I knew that she was a good writer. So I'd had an interest in writing about, like cyber law is not really my core area of expertise, but there was one particular thing, which I'll say in a minute, which I felt like judges were really struggling with, and it would be really helpful to have a paper kind of make an intervention in that struggle. And so I approached Joanne. As an aside, I try to co-author with about one student per year, and I had Joanne in my class like around the time that I was beginning to think about who would be a good person to write with. And so I already had the project in mind in a much more specific way than I had with the consent forms paper. And Joanne was this great student that I had in class. And so I sought her out and asked her if she would be interested in writing something with me. And I think that she was a little bit more surprised than Kira. Like Joanne was very litigation oriented, whereas Kira was maybe a little bit more like Kira had been on law review, and I think maybe had just spent more time with legal scholarship. Joanne hadn't been a research assistant for a professor or anything like that. But she was excited about the idea too, and I thought that it harmonized really nicely with her, like career goals as a prosecutor. And so, what ended up happening there is that I approached her with the idea, and then we kind of hashed it out together by talking about it and talking about a lot of different situations. And the idea, which I'll go ahead and lay out now, is that judges are not good at figuring out what counts as an act of communication in cyberspace. And that is complicated because judges don't understand the internet. Judges don't understand Twitter. Judges don't understand Facebook. They don't understand Snapchat. They don't understand how something that would be innocuous on one platform can actually be, potentially bullying on another platform. Judges don't understand how these platforms work. And so our big picture conclusion was that judges need to get in the habit of getting familiar with different social media platforms if they're going to actually understand what it means to communicate on the internet. But then the sort of more specific intervention that our paper took was to look at the cyber stalking, cyber harassment, and cyberbullying websites in all, or not, I'm sorry, not websites, statutes in all 50 states, and then figure out what would count as communication within the meaning of each state's statutes. And we ended up grouping the state's statutes and came up for a taxonomy of, what would count as communication, and then how that mapped onto the different platforms.
Well, that's interesting. Did you find a wide range of definitions? I mean, I would think that it would be relatively consistent, but maybe not.
Yeah, there was quite a range. And, like some states, basically it's like some states have updated, and some states are still talking about like bulletin boards, right?
Oh, boy. I remember those from when I was in junior high school.
Yeah. And like, how you could potentially like bully somebody by, posting something derogatory on a bulletin board. but there was more range than we expected. I would actually think that there might be less of a range now, although I haven't undertaken to update the research that we did back in, it's probably like 2014 when we were actually doing the research. I haven't undertaken to update that, but I think with the increased focus on the internet and on social media platforms, I think that a bunch of state legislatures have been motivated to make some, we'll call them updates to their laws relating to cyber stalking, cyber harassment, and cyberbullying.
So did you find that there were kind of differences in the collaboration process with that second paper? Or was it largely kind of a similar sort of experience on the sort of collaboration side of the writing and the production of the paper itself?
It was a very different experience. And I think I really appreciate the question, because it's forcing me to think about, like how, from a process standpoint, it was a different paper. I would say that the first paper was a little bit more of an idea paper and a little bit more of, like seeing a phenomenon in the world and figuring out how to explain it. Whereas the second paper involved a problem that pretty much anybody would agree was a problem, and just searching out the data to explain concretely why it was a problem, and then making the law intersect with known facts about the world, specifically the way people communicate on platforms. So I felt that the task was pretty different in each of these works of scholarship. And to me, that really dictated the way that the process evolved differently. Like with the first paper, it was really important to me that Kira and I have a meeting of the minds about, what exactly was the argument that we wanted to make. In terms of the paper I wrote with Joanne, it was more, okay, did we find all of the information? Have we really thought about all the platforms? It was more, how do we organize all of this information and present it in a way that judges, and frankly, hopefully lawyers too, right? Because lawyers are not all doing a good job at writing about the way people communicate on the internet. In a way that hopefully is helpful to lawyers and judges.
So the nature of the project really, in some ways, dictated the nature of the collaboration. That seems to make sense.
Yeah,
to me.
It did. And I'm trying to think. I can't remember if I've co-authored with 6 students or 7 students at this time. I think it's 6 students but 7 papers, because I wrote 2 papers with 1 student. I really find that the nature of the project dictates the collaboration process. Having said that, the student and their goals often dictates what the project looks like in the first place. So, I think that it's kind of maybe an iterative process would be a good way to describe it. Like if Joanne had not had this very clear goal of becoming a prosecutor, I think we potentially could have taken a somewhat different approach to the project. But because she did, I think we wanted to write something that was really grounded and practical and helpful. And that seemed like a really good direction to go.
Right. So I was wondering, without like naming any a particular student or talking about it in too much detail, are there experiences you've had where a collaborative paper project kind of didn't work out as you'd planned? And if so, kind of what would your thoughts be about sort of how to think about, finding good collaborations as opposed to ones that are less likely to be effective?
That's a great question. So I have never had a paper not work out in the sense that it has always, you know, gone through to the end and resulted in a published paper. And I always had what I believe to be a good relationship with the student at the end of the project. I mean, I don't know how the student felt about me, but I liked this. I liked all the students at the end, and they, did not appear to be overtly hostile to me. So, I would say that I've been really lucky to have good collaborators. In terms of things that have come up along the way, you know, I think a lesson that I learned early on was that it was really important for me to recognize that this was not going to be a student's top priority, nor should it be, and to build the writing schedule around their schedule. I think one of the luxuries that we have as professors is that, like we teach our classes and we do a lot of preparation for that and we do our research, but we do have, compared to many people in many professions, we have a lot of flexibility about when we do things. Like, do we work at 5 a.m.? Do we work at 10 p.m.? I think that, different people have different circumstances, but as a generalization, I think that our schedules tend to be pretty flexible. And that's not always true for students, right? Like, they have midterms, they have finals, and this is probably something that should have been obvious from the beginning, but one of the reasons that I made a calendar, like a really detailed calendar with Kira, is because I wanted to know things like, like what weeks would she be doing literally nothing because she would be studying for finals. And then those were the weeks I could plan to spend on my sections. Or, when did she have law firm interviews? And, like same kind of thing. And then vice versa. So, I think it was important for me to just be really aware of my co-author's schedule in a way that it wouldn't necessarily for a collaboration with another professor. And again, I think that this is a situation where individual mileage may vary. Like, different people have different kinds of demands on their time. But I think that law students have a lot of demands, and it was important to chart that out.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic point, and one that I think I have not been as cognizant of as I probably should be. It's so easy to forget how much flexibility we can have, and not to realize how much of a time crunch they can find themselves in. Yeah. So, well, changing speed just a little bit, I was wondering if you could talk about the reception of co-authors' papers, both, when you're submitting them to law reviews and also, among colleagues and so on, sort of, do you get a sense of how people think about papers that you've co-authored with students? Do they think about them differently than papers you've written by yourself, which is still, for better or worse, the norm in legal academy? Or do you find that people treat them the same as anything else?
I'm so glad that you asked that, Brian, because I've really found a whole range of reception in the legal academy. Some people are really interested in the idea, and if they think it's a good idea and a good paper, like, they don't care whose name is on it, whether it's my name or a student's name or my name and the student's name. Other people, and I would say this is a minority, but I think that there are some people who are a little bit patronizing when it comes to student involvement, or they make assumptions that are not necessarily true. Like, they assume that the student wrote the paper and then I added my name to it. And, I think that there may be professors in the legal academy and elsewhere who do that. I would never have my name on a piece of scholarship unless I had been intimately involved in its creation, right? Because
Yeah.
um, I wouldn't, given what the norms are in the legal academy, like I would feel total responsibility for the paper and I want to say about it. So I think that some people have had the reaction that, like nobody's like ever literally said this to me, but well, the student must have like written the first draft and then like, like you clean it up and added your name to it. And that's that again, like that may be true with some
Mm,
people. Not like casting aspersions on anyone, but that's not at all how I work. Like that would be an inaccurate description of of any of my papers. Some people were a little bit sort of what's the word? Like I said condescending, and I think I've again, and this is a minority of people, but there are some people who kind of communicated without actually saying the words, something like, "Oh, that's cute. You're writing with a student. Like you're so nice to do that." And I was like,
mm,
well, I don't really think of it as being nice. I think of it as doing something that is good for my career, right? Like students have good ideas and unique perspectives on the law.
mm-hmm,
And,
mm,
yeah, just to mention another of my collaborations, I've got a paper coming out in the Cardozo Law Review with Emily Bartlett, who is another former student of mine, and her undergraduate major
mm,
was nutrition. And so we wrote a paper about the health consequences of sex segregation in sports. And she had all of this information and knowledge about eating disorders, right? Like things that would have taken me months to dig into on my own. And so all of that is just to say that this isn't sort of like me, like holding a student's hand and like leading them through the collaboration process. Like this is the student really bringing something unique. And I felt that was true with each of my collaborations. But that didn't seem to be, that did seem to be what everybody thought of it. So there's really been kind of a range of reactions. And to go back to your earlier point, Brian, I think that's because this is not the norm in the legal academy, the way it is in other disciplines. And I think it's a shame.
yeah. No, I agree. I mean, my experience has been the same, that I learn a lot from my students when I write with them, because they all bring knowledge that I don't have myself.
Even just, like a second, at a minimum, they're bringing a second brain,
Yeah.
right? Which can only make the project better. But a lot of the time, they also have like a whole knowledge platform, or people have had careers before law school. It can be really fruitful for those reasons too. I'm curious how people have responded to your collaborations with students.
I think I have to say my experiences have been very similar to your own. There's a real range of people who don't care, people who think it's cool, and people who kind of look down their nose at it. And, I think that's unfortunate, because I really think, and it sounds like you've had the similar experience to me, but I found it a very beneficial experience. Um, you know, in learning from the student, in having somebody else to bounce ideas off of and get the paper together faster. But also it's a great kind of pedagogical experience for the student. And I think it's really rewarding for them as a learning experience.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's, like I've described all of my collaborations as equal collaborations, and that's certainly true. Something that I have that the student doesn't have is I kind of have, like our unique publishing, the idiosyncrasies of the law review publication process figured out, or maybe figured out would be a little bit strong because nobody has that figured out. But like I've been to that rodeo a few
Yeah.
times, and I know things like, okay, so we need to submit through Scholastica and Expresso, and I think we should probably submit to about this many journals, and then like these are some good specialty journals that I think would be a good home for the piece too, like that kind of thing, right? And I make sure to always sit down with the student, and we submit the paper together.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in fact, they submit the paper and I kind of sit at their elbow, like, like talking about the pros and cons of doing things a certain way.
Oh, that's cool.
So that's definitely part of the process.
And so in closing, I know that you involve your co-authors in kind of the afterlife of the paper as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of like getting the paper out there into the world and how you involve your co-authors in that process.
So I always try to find at least one and perhaps more additional ways for the student to engage in, as you say, the afterlife of the paper. So for example, with Kira, she presented the consent forms paper with me at the University of Denver at our in-house faculty colloquium. Joanne, in her first year as a prosecutor, I was invited to give a talk at the Colorado Women's Bar Association on cyber law related topics. And so I was like, this is perfect. Like, we'll present our paper. I took another collaborator of mine, Erin Belzer, to the Junior Faculty Federal Courts Conference, which I think was amazing for everybody involved. Erin and I also wrote a Washington Post op-ed on one of our collaborations, and so these are just examples, but I promote work that I write with students just like I promote my own work. Like, I want to make sure that it's getting to the right people in the academy and beyond the academy. Now, all of this, of course, is limited by my own time and the students' time, but I think that there are a lot of really interesting and fruitful ways that you can introduce the student not just to the process of producing scholarship, but also to this larger scholarly conversation and the way that it interfaces with the popular media. And I think that if somebody's going to take the time to, embark on a collaboration with a student, why not do all of it, right? Like, why not involve the student in the rest of it as well? And again, I see that as something with benefits for me, right? It was like really cool to be at this conference with Joanne, a practicing prosecutor, like talking about this thing we'd written together, and something with benefits to the student, right? Because it was a conference that she wouldn't necessarily have been invited to without, a tenured professor as a co-author. So yeah, I mean, I think that the afterlife of the collaboration is, in some sense, just as important as the collaboration itself. And I would encourage anybody who's thinking about collaborating to think about that as well, because it's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Nancy, this has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot about how to make my own collaborations with students better. And I hope listeners will consider co-authoring papers with their students as well. And I can only say that I wish I had been able to take your classes as a law student, because it sounds like you're a lot of fun to work with.
Oh my goodness, that's so kind of you. And believe me, it goes both ways.
Awesome. Well, I hope to talk to you soon.
Okay, take care, Brian. Thanks again for having me on.
Snap, what a happy sound. Snap is the happiest sound I found. You may clap, rap, tap, slap, but snap makes the world go round. Snap, crackle, pop, Rice Krispies. I say it's crackle, the crispy sound. You gotta have crackle or the clock's not wound. Geese crackle, feathers tickle, belts buckle, beats pickle, but crackle makes the world go round. Snap, crackle, pop, Rice Krispies. Now I insist that pop's the sound. The best is missed the less pop's around. You can't stop hopping when the cereal's popping. Pop makes the world go round. Snap, crackle, pop, Rice Krispies. Snap, it's crackle, the pop is the sound. You gotta have crackle as the pop's not round. You make clap, stop, rapping when the cereal's popping. Snap, crackle, pop makes the world go round. Kellogg's best to you.